Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agri. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, we're here at Groundswell 2022, and I'm talking to Professor Andy Neal, soil microbiologist from Rothamsted, and John Crawford, who is leading the Global Soil Health Programme at the University of Glasgow. With all the discussion about regenerative farming and soil health, the big question is, how do we make that happen on farm? And how do we bring science together with farming and farming together with science? So my big question is, well, where do we start? Do we start with the theory? Andy, what are your thoughts?
I think understanding the theory is critical to this because just jumping into a black box and trying to understand the whole thing is without any theory is really not going to get us very far. So understanding that theory, and John and I have been developing a theory now for I guess about 5 years. It's starting to mature, and I think we're both starting to understand a lot more about the intricacies of soil as a biological system. I think once we start to understand it as a biological system, then we can start to understand what the key parts of that system are to focus on and to take care of, so that we can improve the health of soil as a biological entity instead of just soil that plants stand up in.
Thanks, Andy. And John, from your perspective, you're responsible for leading a global programme. Tell us a bit more about what does that mean with regards to soil health?
Well, I think we're at the point now with climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we need to stop talking and start doing. And science is all about being perfect, but the job of farming is about getting stuff done. And so I've kind of want to devote what's left of my career to trying to work with farmers and learn from them, and hopefully they can learn a bit from me about how we can really get this done at scale and on time.
Yeah, and here at Groundswell, I mean, it's incredible the number of farmers, growers, and advisors in the industry who are attending all the seminar tents there, clearly wanting to learn from each other. So how do we connect that science, that understanding of the soils and soil health with the practical elements of farming? Where do we actually start, Andy?
Well, I suppose the route we're taking is talking to farmers directly, and my research is now focused largely down in Devon, and I'm very lucky in Devon to have a lot of farmers around us that are trying out different regenerative practices, and a lot of them are just, I guess, taking a punt. They're actually quite brave in what they're doing, and in fact, very often they're quite a way ahead of where our research is at the moment. So the way I want to do that is to find those farmers and learn from what they're doing. When they tell me something's working, help them understand why and generate the fundamental understanding of what they're doing that's creating that effect. We can then learn from them as an academic community, but also then proselytize that message out to other farmers who need perhaps a little bit of confidence to think, I'd like to do it, but I'm not sure it works. If we can generate that scientific understanding, then everyone can be much more confident about jumping in and buying new bits of equipment or completely changing the way they farm.
Yeah, and in principle, John, do you have a view, if you like, a reality check on what farmers are starting to do that is starting to have a benefit on farm?
I think there are some kind of universal principles where there's a scientific consensus that bare soil is not a great idea. And I do see a lot of farmers increasingly using cover crops in winter, but also thinking about how they disturb their soil and maybe using minimum till or no-till practices. But your point about how do we learn, I think is a fundamentally important thing that needs to change. The way we do science tends to be quite, first of all, siloed, and also in an ivory tower separated from farming. And actually there's a hell of a lot of innovation happening on farm that science misses out on, and vice versa. And there's no such thing as a new idea. It's just an idea, it's just a bunch of old ideas cobbled together. In general, that's how the global economy works. Let's create an economy of knowledge for farmers.
So, John's nicely created a question I've got for you now, Andy, and I know you're good friends as well. So, Has all the research been done? Is it now about actually bringing all the current understanding together? Is that where we're at?
That's a really good question, because I think there's a lot of stuff that we already know that certainly needs to be put into practice on farms, and that's possibly partly the fault of scientists in not being prepared to come to events like this and talk about what they're doing. As I've worked longer and longer in soil, I suppose I started out thinking I was an academic, but now when I sit down and think about my job and my career, I'm almost like an extension of the agriculture industry, in the sense that I'm trying to generate the knowledge that farmers are, they're doing experiments all over the country, all over the world. And I think what John and I have discussed a lot is that we should be using those experiments, using our skills to understand what's going on there.
So the question about this communication of the science and connecting with farmers, John, from your point of view and a global perspective, how do you do that? How do we do that? How do we connect with farming communities worldwide?
So the way I see it is not connecting science to farming, it's connecting farming to science. A lot of the way we've done science traditionally has been quite compartmentalised, which means we try to vary only one thing in the lab or in the field. But in reality, everything's varying in everybody's fields. And I take very seriously this fact that we've got a short time to transform the way we produce food, for all sorts of reasons. And if we really want to accelerate that innovation process, we need to work with the collective intelligence of the farming community out there, globally, who are doing real experiments. They call it farming, we call it experiments. They're growing stuff in lots of different environments. They're growing lots of different things in different ways. They're fiddling around using their intuition, which is often a very, very good guide. And we're not learning from that. So what we would like to do, and what we're starting with farmers in Indonesia, in Borneo, in Malaysia, South America, North America and Europe, is starting to develop a platform where farmers have total control over their data and who they share it with, but they start to share with each other and learn from each other. So they own the platform, they create the knowledge, and they share it with who they want to share it with, and I'm hoping we can convince them to share it with scientists, so that we can also, in return, share the new knowledge. Rather than just farmers listening to hearsay, they can be confident that there's been some kind of scientific analysis done and a consensus globally that certain things work really well in certain circumstances, rather than just having to listen to hearsay or the promises of a company that's looking to make a lot of money out of ignorance.
And let's walk up towards the tent. So look, as we walk up, and we can see all the stands. We can see just, this event is absolutely, it's full, it's buzzing with excitement. And there is excitement in the industry, isn't there? But the bottom line that farmers have come here to really find out is, so what? So, and Andy, that is the question. You're a scientist. You've done incredible work. The so what is, what can a farmer achieve to give that farm resilience and profitability for the future? What are they going to be doing that's really going to make that big difference?
That's a really interesting question, because I think a lot of it brings the discussion down to organic carbon in soil, which I'm concerned is largely discussed as a point of we need to sequester carbon in soil. And sometimes if you listen to the media and what's being discussed, that's the sole reason we should be interested in carbon. But what John and my work has been showing that, well, other people's work as well, it's not just us, that soil carbon is actually an intrinsic part of soil. You can't have soil without carbon. And so when it comes to the so what, if you take care of the organic matter in your soil, we know, we have the evidence now that you create a much more resilient system. And it's resilient because it stores more water during dry periods, because this organic matter and the combination between organic matter and microbial respiration and metabolism creates a much more porous network in soil, rather like a sponge. The more pores in there, the more water it can hold. And we've got clear, distinct evidence, and I don't think there's any argument about this scientifically anymore, that the more carbon you have in your soil, up to a limit, the greater porosity you create, and you store more water. That also creates a sort of place for water to run away, so you start controlling the whole water cycle by having healthy, carbon-rich soils. So, there's although the discussion is predominantly, drowned out and it's all about sequestration, actually the real benefits for farmers are all these co-benefits that we're now starting to understand, and we're now starting to understand that pore network has a control on how much nitrogen is stored in your soil, and if you store more carbon, you naturally are storing more nitrogens, and that's another form of resilience that organic matter in soil creates. So it's not some esoteric discussion of sequestration. There are some real tangible, practical benefits of having organic matter in soil.
And if you want to learn more or hear more about understanding organic matter in soil, then do listen to Andy's podcast that's on Tramlines. It's really, really interesting in terms of understanding that science and some of the research that he's done. But John, coming back to you, Andy's just talked about water, soil water, and the resilience from that perspective. But the big question lots of farmers are asking, and I'm sure worldwide too, is, well, what about the benefits in terms of nutrient availability?
So I think foremost in farmers' minds right now is cost of inputs. Now, the financial cost of inputs has rocketed horribly and is becoming a massive issue. But of course, the environmental cost of inputs is also high. So Andy and I often joke, my background is in physics and I deal with dead stuff and he deals with the living stuff, and together we kind of deal with soil. Conventional agriculture has either short-circuited the living parts or killed it, right? That's how we deal with biology in agriculture. But living with nature creates a whole bunch of benefits for farmers. The natural fertility of soil becomes boosted, the inputs can be lower, what you input can be used more efficiently, greater resilience of the system. So there's kind of three benefits to farmers. Total throughput, which links to yield, will increase. The resilience, which is how stable is your yield to changes in climate, which is increasingly hard to predict now. And efficiency, so how much of the money that you spend on inputs actually ends up in the plant. That's what we're trying to optimise with the science that we're doing.
Sure, so I'm going to challenge you guys even further, because we're talking about the impact on farm and linking science with the farming. What does that actually mean for the farmers, the farm businesses that are there right now? What are they going to be able to see financially as a benefit, or in terms of gain in crop performance, or even just maintaining performance? What do you think they can look forward to expecting?
I think the benefits we're seeing would be a reduction in inputs.
So to what extent? I mean, a reduction in inputs is easy for anybody to talk about, but do you think it's feasible, as some farmers are talking about, of reducing their nitrogen inputs by 30-40% on some farms, on some soil types?
But look at the increased nitrogen that's being stored in soil in the experiments that we've been analysing. The paper that you're literally publishing
That's
right now.
right. So that's yes. No, you're right, John.
If
so
I can prompt you.
There is 2 or 3 times as much nitrogen stored in soil if you have ready access to a lot of composted farmyard manure. And we think that this relationship between carbon and nitrogen metabolism in the soil means that the more organic carbon you sequester, the more organic nitrogen you're holding as well. So that means that you can get away with putting less bagged nitrogen in there. So a lot of the benefits will not necessarily be in increased yield, but will come from reduced inputs. And there's other evidence as well that suggests, a plough moves much more easily through a soil that has a lot of organic matter in it, so you're saving on diesel as well. There's lots of little bits that all add up to quite a lot. Now, but I'm not sure we've actually totted that all up to say, and the number is, but there's a lot of evidence out there that all these little things can add together to help farmers lower their bottom line or increase their bottom line. Sorry,
and that's what we're hearing from farmers. When we're interviewing them here on Tramlines, we're hearing evidence, pieces of evidence from around the UK. And sometimes it's not easy to quantify it in terms of pure pounds, shillings and pence, so to speak, but we are hearing that. And you, as you said, you bring that all together, it's a real benefit in this challenging time, isn't it? I'm really interested, John, from a global perspective, are these needs of farmers the same worldwide?
Yeah. If there's one magic wand that I would like to wave for the farming community globally, it's double everybody's salary. Farming has been, it's a race to the bottom. farmers, because farming is so fragmented as a community globally, it's hard to fight against the big players. And one of the things that we would like to do by creating this sharing platform is essentially create a global cooperative and empower farmers with data in the same way that Google is empowered by data, to have more agency in the discussions moving forward about how farming should look, because farmers farm the way they have to farm to make a living, and it's increasingly scraping a living, and in many countries it's literally survival. That needs to change. If we want farmers to invest in the environment, we have to pay them.
And of course, we need a profitable farming industry, don't we? Because then those farmers are able to invest in new techniques, attend events like today, and actually invest their time, don't they?
Yeah, we want the next generation of young, vibrant farmers coming along who are really excited, not just about how farming produces food, but how it produces a whole bunch of co-benefits that Andy was talking about. Flood protection, climate mitigation, of course nutritious food. I mean, our food system literally is the biggest cause of chronic disease globally. How does that work, right? We need to change very much the way we do things, and farmers should be in the driving seat of that.
And in terms of that change, that leads me on to ask the final question of today, really, which is, what top tip would you really ask listeners to think about as they go off into their day's work, in terms of what they should focus on and really, really look into that could make that big difference, that transition? Maybe it's understanding the science to be able to put that into practice on farm, but what thought is that? Andy, I can see you thinking in a very pensive way. What's your top tip?
Well, I think the top tip I've learnt is disturb your soil as little as possible. And I know that I'm not a practical farmer, so I know that there are good reasons to disturb your soil in some instances. But I would always think, do I really need to disturb this soil? Because if there's one thing that we've shown directly influences the amount of organic matter in soil and all of these co-benefits that we've discussed today, it's how long ago did you last disturb the soil? And if that is very recent, then your soil will be in a worse off state than if it was 5 years ago. That ploughing or some sort of disturbance is really the most detrimental thing that I've come across in all the research that we've done.
Thanks, Andy. And John, from your perspective, and also from that global farming perspective, what are your thoughts?
Teamwork. Work together, share with each other, cooperate, and I hope that we're able to make the case that farmers can work with science and trust science. Farmers struggle to know who to trust for new knowledge, and we're moving, I think, into a biological era with farming. That is not a turnkey solution. That's hard to do, and it's very site specific, and farmers will say that it's too expensive and it doesn't work. It will get cheaper as more people use it, and it will work if we share our knowledge.
So Andy, we're here at Groundswell. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. It's a very busy event. What are you enjoying the most?
I guess what I'm enjoying the most, and what I enjoyed the most last time I came, is actually getting so many people all thinking about the similar way of farming together, to be able to communicate to them, to be able to learn from them, bump into them at the food queue or the coffee queue, and start to, as an academic, start to understand the problems, the fences and hurdles that farmers have to climb over, and incorporate that into my thinking when I'm thinking about what hypotheses do we need to test next.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, John, for that really enlightening discussion about how we can link the science to farming when it comes to regen agriculture and improving soil health. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agri.co.uk. See you next time.